As I get older, I find myself no longer wanting the fastest bike, the most performance, or the biggest engine. It seems things that I desire most are reliability, long service intervals, and huge aftermarket support. Today here at Motorcycles Off-Road, we will compare something old against something new, something that has aged gracefully versus something that has been modernly refined. We're going to compare these two bikes, which are some of the most reliable bikes on the market. When it comes to reliability, I would have to say the DR650 is probably one of the kings here. It's been around for so long and it has been proven to last. Now the CRF300 platform is no slouch either. It's been out for 3 years and it's a modification of an older engine, the 250 engine, which also proved its longevity, but in the 3 years I've seen little to no engine failure, and if every once in a while you could find a one-off, it might be due to user error or just bad luck. Now why do I start with reliability? Because reliability to me is one of the most important things. Let's just think about this for a second. Let's say you're setting up for the Trans-American Trail, the Trans-European Trail, a BDR, or you're just going to travel across your country, right? You're saying, hey, I want to go all across Australia. The lead up is you thinking about it for months, weeks to you preparing, you get everything set, you're even losing sleep at night thinking about how much fun you're going to have. You go to do this trip, 2 days into the trip, your bike fails. Now that is heart-wrenching. You might not be able to plan a trip like this and get everything to line for up to years. So when I think of a good motorcycle to do something like this, reliability has to be at the start. So then join me throughout this video, my 27,000 subscribers, and the 88% of you who are not subscribed yet. I hope that you find my perspective informative, and for all you who are not subbed, I earned your sub. And also the best way to support the channel is become a new channel member, that's something new, or you could become the Patreon counterpart, which is basically the same except for the Patreon, there's a huge backlog, it costs a little less, but the advantage of the channel supporter is you don't have to make an extra account. Either way, I'd be grateful if you just consider supporting, and let's get into the meat of this video. In the past, when I do comparisons like this, I sometimes have random people saying, how could you even compare these two bikes? They're not even similar. You always get a couple random people saying that, but I always get at least twice as many people saying, thank you so much. These two bikes are exactly what I was looking for, and this comparison helped me out a lot. Today though, I feel like this comparison breaks the mold a bit. Now on paper, these two motorcycles are very similar in many ways. They're both heavy dual sports. They basically have the same seat height. They have the same ground clearance. They have the exact same fuel capacity. They're both from Japanese manufacturers, and both are somewhere in the mid-class, with the MSRP being pretty similar. If someone's looking for a motorcycle that can do everything, like traveling across your country, commuting to work, exploration, and off-road stuff, it's no surprise to me that somebody would be looking between these two motorcycles. Through my experience, I want to offer to you all my knowledge from these two motorcycles so you can know one, more about them, or if you're trying to buy them, make the best decision for you. Now I have done a full fleshed out review of both of these motorcycles. You can go check them out. And for sure, go check them out if you're leaning to buy one over the other. But man, when it comes to a motorcycle that's sold new today, and we talk about reliability, utility, and something I would really prefer to take on long trips, a bike I can really trust, these two are definitely on the top of the list. First, let's talk a little bit about specifications. I could put the specs that most people look into on the screen here, but as with many things, there's so much more to consider than what you can just see on a black and white spec sheet. One big point you can glean is the price. New, the Honda comes in at $61.99 MSRP and the DR $7,099 MSRP, putting the DR about $900 more, which is pretty much the cost of a full round suspension, which is also probably a tax that you're going to have to pay if you buy either of these motorcycles. Both, in a lot of scenarios, will need a suspension, and we'll talk about that later in the video. But once again, when it comes to overall utility and usefulness of these two dual sports, almost adventure bikes, the DR and the Rally fall in a weird class, where both of them are a bit heavy for something you might want to take on single track or consider a light dual sport, but much lighter than anything you would find in the adventure class. So this class they fall into alone is very rare, and you're talking a range of usefulness able to do about 90% of things that people would want to do off-road, and still maintaining a good ability to travel on-road with pretty good efficiency. So while we're on this topic, let's first talk about weight. So the DR is about 10% more weight than the Rally. We have 335 pounds to 366 pounds of the DR. Not a huge difference, but let me have you consider something. In actuality, the DR is a bit heavier when it's set for the purpose. See, the efficiency of the tight tolerance liquid-cooled 282cc Honda engine is much greater. Now, both of these bikes sport a 3.4 gallon fuel tank stock, But the range of the CRF is much larger. So much so that most people, and me alike, will carry extra fuel for the DR to compensate. Most people get a larger fuel capacity tank, where I customize the bracket to put a 1.3 gallon extra jerry can on the side at about the same result. To get the range desired on this class of bike like this, you will need more fuel. So right off the start, you're looking at another 12 to 15 pounds or 5 to 7 kilograms on weight gain on a DR. But what do you get of this loss of efficiency and gain in engine size? Well, you get this. Smiles all the time. In my own testing, I will note that I ran the DR stock tank, and I ran it completely down to dry with a mix of on and off-road and got exactly 140 miles or 225 kilometers. But okay, with aftermarket jetting that mostly everybody's going to do, this is to be expected. So with that transition, let's start to talk about performance. Of course, the larger DR engine performs way better in raw horsepower and torque numbers. For me, it's very hard to speak of the lack of power for the CRF platform because both my 300L and my Rally were never stock for long. Just having the ECU tuned exhaust and an air filter meant the CRF had no problems climbing highway grade hills in 6th gear all day long. But I'd be remiss not to mention that I have seen in other reviews that some people have complained that the stock bike might have lackluster performance in full wind climbing hills in 6th gear. I guess to compare the power/travel department, there's a point of diminishing returns, right? To step up to the DR's power is nice, but it's up to you to decide that if it's worth the fuel economy lost, which is almost half. This is down to the personal preference, but I'm assuming that most people have no problem with the extra weight and the larger tank, which means for sure the DR is a bit more usable on the road, and in this department I'd say it edges out the Honda with its large 644cc thumper. Now, one thing to note with the road and highway in general is that the 300 Rally also has wind protection. You may not feel like this makes a big difference, but it actually does, especially in cold climates when the wind's not just smashing against your legs and your chest, but also it's less fatiguing. The Rally's fairings do just enough to keep the wind off your legs, and a small windscreen works quite well actually. Interestingly enough, many criticisms of the DR is that people want fuel injection and a 6th gear. That's a whole topic for another video of why they can't just do this, but it should be noted that the Honda already has fuel injection and a 6th gear, and implemented really well also. I can tell you the Honda's transmission is a dream. I would go on a limb and say that if the Honda's gear set transmission was in the DR, that would be my unicorn bike. It's not just that the Honda has a 6th gear over the DR's 5, it's smooth in every single gear selection, it just falls into place. Like when you shift, it just belongs there. There's no resistance, there's no clank, it's just smooth and easily manageable. The slipper assist clutch makes the clutch pull effortless, and the transmission is geared in such a way that the 6th is very tall, and it's very good for low RPMs highway travel. It's not a linear path, as most transmissions are, so just slapping it into 6th keeps you nice and low and less vibey on the highway. All that being said, the 5-speed of the DR is the best use of a 5-speed that I've ever experienced on a dual sport motorcycle. Not only are the gears spaced nice and wide apart, and you can effortlessly cruise at highway speeds in 5th gear, but there's just so much wealth of power and torque that you can pull out of this 644cc single engine. I feel in most case scenarios with a 6-speed transmission, it kind of feels like you're never really in the right gear. You're always upshifting to 3rd or dropping back down to 2nd, or sometimes a tight climb when you need to be in 1st. But the DR doesn't really matter. It tractors along. You could be in 2nd gear for probably most of 80% of all the off-road riding you do. Just sit in 2nd gear and climb up anything. You need more speed, you just give it a bit more gas. Very rarely did I find myself on heavy off-road conditions ever shifting into 3rd. It was 1st to take off, 1st to climb, and 2nd for everything else. So all this being said, my personal opinions is when it comes to a manual transmission on a dual sport, these two bikes do it best. But if I had to give an edge to one or the other, I would have to say overall the CRF truly wins out, having the tall 6th and just being such a smooth transmission. And there's also something on the side you can note of the gear selector of your transmission. The CRF really feels good and just slightly edges out the DR. Ooh, feels so different. All right, you go first. Just straight, yeah. Oh, the throttle feels so much different. Thing feels oddly wider but smaller. What? It's more your style, right? Now let's talk about fuel injection. At this point, you will find some late adopters saying that they still prefer a carburetor, but I can tell you from owning both that fuel injection is definitely the way to go. Look, I'm with you. My first bike was an XR300L, a 1998 model, and I loved that bike. But the advantages of fuel injection, well, one big one is the quality of fuel today is a big reason alone, whereas a carburetor relies on basically vacuum pulling up gas through a little tiny hole. In fuel injection, you actually have a pump that's pushing the fuel through the injector itself. But you never have to worry about rejetting your carburetor for elevation changes, temperature, and also most of the time for modifications to stuff like exhaust or airbox. You also have the advantage of an ECU. ECU flash is a big upgrade that you can do to something like the CRF300L Rally without having to change much else, and this is like a 15-minute process to put a new flashed ECU in the bike. And unlike with a carburetor where you're just simply adding more fuel, an ECU can change anything. It can take out twitchiness in the throttle, it can advance your timing, to a point it can even change when the power comes in. Now the counterpoint is carburetors are easier to clean if they get gummed up, and they're very easy to clean on the trail. Now the two main pushbacks I see for fuel injection these days are someone who says the carb is less things to break on the trail, which is true. There's less of a computer involved. And also you always have the random doomsday prepper that tells you that, an EMP strike or whatever. If these are thoughts you have, then maybe they do sway your mind from the CRF to the DR. Firstly, you very rarely hear about a fuel injection system failing on a Japanese motorcycle. It's basically unheard of. And I mean, once again, we've been working with fuel injection for 4 decades now, and most of the issues you could run into are basically ironed out. But not to say that it won't fail, it could. And then of course we have the what if an EMP strike. Man, I actually have seen this one a lot, commenting on my own videos, but also your carbureted bikes have a computer too. If electromagnetic strike was to take out your fuel injection bike, it will most likely take out the carb bikes as well, so it's kind of a ridiculous point to make and a highly unlikely scenario. I would say you have more grounds to say that if the fuel injectors do get gummed up on the trail, you're going to run into more issues than you would as a car. And if you add a little bit of fuel additive to the bike every time you change the oil, I don't think you're going to run into any problems. But it is true to say that fuel these days is not as clean as it used to be. So overall, when it comes to this point, I would have to say fuel injection is a win for the CRF300 Rally. I mean, the power comes on linear, the power comes on quickly. In my personal experience, I just feel like in fuel injection, you have more control. So let's talk about off-road. I spend more time off-road running than I do any other type of riding, so this area is very close to my heart. I mentioned at the start of the video that the suspension is a tax that you would pay with both of these bikes. Well, it definitely rings true here. Both the DR and the Rally will need suspension if you plan to do great aggressive off-road, or if you plan on using these bikes as an adventure camping platform, which is something that both of these bikes are made for, so most people will do. Look, if you buy either of these motorcycles just to commute to work, on back roads just to enjoy yourself, you're not going to need suspension. But you start loading it down with camping gear, or if you're a bigger guy and you start to take it off-road, you will feel the limitations of suspension on both of these motorcycles. When it comes to overall handling off-road, it's kind of a toss-up, but I would say the Rally is more strictly a capable off-road bike. According to what we said before, we'd have to assume that the Rally is about 10 to 15% lighter, but not only that, it wears its weight really well. It's made within the past few years and designed with modern physics software before a prototype would have ever been created. Back during the DR's concept, this was not an option. At the time, motorcycles were a slight design or alteration of former bikes, making incremental improvements overall. The technology was just quite different. On the side of the CRF, they could determine exactly the force that's pushed upon you when a bike's in specific situations, like speed, grade, etc., without even making the bike yet. This is a huge advantage, and this is why you hear a ton of reviewers say the CRF300L feels much lighter than the weight numbers would suggest on the paper. Now, on the flip side of this, at the expense of ground clearance, you can lower the DR to a low position, putting the seat height a little bit lower, which it doesn't sound like much, but it actually puts the burden of weight much lower and makes the bike seem more stable and easier for you to reach the ground. In this case, it would put the DR to be a more adventure type bike over a dual sport, which I would have to admit, that's what I use this motorcycle for, and that's what I think most people will use this motorcycle for. When I sold my Tenere 700, I bought a combination of the DR as my adventure replacement and an XT250 for my daughter, and the DR was already set to a low seat setting. And I love this bike for adventure tasks. It had plenty of power on the road, the suspension was done, so I could load it down with anything I need, and it's fully capable off-road. If I'm being objectively honest though, the DR's power is not really used when it comes to off-road. My Rally with a few inexpensive performance upgrades and just a few extra teeth on a rear sprocket was enough to do anything off-road. In places, let's say, where I needed power and if I had to rally at 50 to 60% throttle, the DR would sit at maybe 30% to 40% throttle, for example. The DR is a ton of fun off-road, and you have to decide for yourself that that's something you're after if you're willing to sacrifice some functionality or at the very least fuel economy. Another minor thing to mention, but it should be talked about if you plan on buying this motorcycle, is that the DR650 comes with a 21 17-inch wheel package, whereas the CRF300 Rally comes with the standard 21 18. Once again, that's not too much of a big deal, but it does kind of limit you on what kind of rubber you can put on a tire. Where I find a rear 18-inch wheel has so many great options, and you can really pick the type of tire that you need for the terrain that you most likely ride. For me, someone who rides a lot of sand and sometimes mountains, I end up going with a 70-30 tire and drilled into the rim and added my own rim locks. Which, fair enough, it did pretty good, but it never quite did as good as my D606 or Trackmaster that I would run on the rear of something like the Rally. I truly feel by the design of the DR, it was made more of an adventure bike concept back when it was made. It really excels here. But also, there's some key points to notice about this, and I don't just mean its self-suspension. One is the foot pegs. They're not only positioned higher than a dual sport would be. Keep in mind, Suzuki also makes the DRZ, so they know where to put the foot pegs, but the foot pegs on the DR are mounted on rubber. This for the road and adventure trails is great because you feel less vibration from the giant thumper, but on single track or aggressive off-road, you never really feel one with the bike. So what do? Well, you swap them out for a more robust, connected to the frame, lower position foot pegs. But then you find it sits a bit low and it seems to catch on everything, rocks and ruts, etc. The bar stock are also positioned in such a way that invites you to sit back and enjoy the ride, rather than get up on the bars and ride aggressively, which some people call the attack position. So to me, that makes it clear that the DRZ is Suzuki's dual sport, where the DR650 is an early adoption of an adventure trim. But that's a big distinction to make when it comes to choosing what's the right bike for you. You really have to reflect on yourself and decide what you want to do. I find over and over again, people buy motorcycles with the idea that they're going to take it more off-road or they're going to do more on-road, and then about 6 months in, or maybe sooner, they have buyer's remorse and then find out truly what they want to do with their motorcycle. But honestly, if you want a really efficient off-road motorcycle, then neither of these bikes are probably for you. But if you had to choose one, the Rally does it just a little bit better, being it actually is a dual sport, just with some extras. Alright, let's touch on maintenance real quick. When it comes to maintenance, I have to report that both of these motorcycles are fantastic. Besides all your standard maintenance like chain tension, spark plug, etc., the big ones to consider is oil change intervals and valve clearance check. The DR650 sitting at 3,500 miles or 6,000 kilometers between oil changes, and valve checks every other oil change. Where the Honda sits at the insane 8,000 miles or 12,800 kilometers for oil and valves every other oil change. For both of these bikes, that's pretty great. That means you can basically do the whole Trans-American Trail without ever having to change your oil on the trip. For me, that's a huge thumbs up. On to the display. Now, this is something I like to mention in my CRF videos because of the fact that I feel like the Honda has really done it right. It has exactly what I want on a display, and it's not crammed with a bunch of extra BS. I don't need to go through menus to turn off ABS. I don't need to do any of that stuff. What I like is a speedometer, a tachometer, fuel capacity, and a gear indicator is nice, but not so important. When looking at the DR, you get exactly what you would expect from a bike from the 90s. It's very analog, but you can install something like the Trailtech Vapor, which actually makes it feel a lot more modern. But obviously it's worth noting that the Honda is the clear winner, and I think that almost any bike in the Honda's class, it just beats out with this feature. It's something I really enjoy about this motorcycle. So taking everything I've said here, and if you go through the video and I'm looking at my notes, it really sounds like the Honda has pulled away in almost every aspect except for power and road, of course. And road, it could be hit or miss depending on if you prioritize wind protection and fuel efficiency over more highway power. So you must be thinking, well, Andrew, then you like the CRF Rally better, right? And not exactly. If I had to choose between one or the other, it's a very hard decision, because even though the Honda has all these amenities and it feels much more modern, there's just something about having an older motorcycle that's raw power, that's equally as reliable, and that can do everything. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say that the DR doesn't have its downfalls. It definitely does, and so does the Honda Honda, of course. But quite honestly, if you have one of these bikes already, you've already succeeded. Both of them are fantastic, and it's not an easy decision like if I was to compare the CRF versus the KLX. Those two are basically so similar that the little nuances that you prefer one over the other really play to the difference for your personal preference, whereas these bikes are great in their own way. As I said in the start of the video, if I'm going to travel across my country, if I'm going to do a BDR, at this point there's no other bike than one of these two that I would rather do it on. And when I say dual sport, I mean dual sport. I don't mean one of these bikes that somebody takes a plated dirt bike and they're doing hair scrambles with, and it's got massive amounts of power but small service intervals and loads of potential issues. I'm talking about a true dual sport, and both of these bikes are, and I love them both for it. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as I said, if you want to support the channel, the best ways to do it is to subscribe, become a channel supporter, or the Patreon equivalent. These videos are hard to make. This one actually I've been editing for probably 2 weeks on and off, just getting the footage alone and doing all this stuff. Hey, I'm not complaining. I enjoy doing it, but you do get pennies for the hours that you put in. And it's always an amazing feeling that you can't describe when people are willing to support you. So thanks guys. I request that you be safe whenever you go out riding. My name is Andrew, and this is Motorcycles Off-Road. Thanks for watching guys.